Alright, welcome back to the channel, my friends. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and today we're taking a look at New Year, New Army. Top tips from painting pros for tackling your project. And I'm going to go ahead and chime in as well as a painting pro with some of my own insights. This video is sponsored by CMO Games. More on that later. Alright, so New Year, New Army. Top tips from the painting pros for tackling your projects. It's a long road to Armies on Parade 2023. So to get you on your way, we're kicking things off with the New Year, New Army once more. You'll find great tips and ideas on Warhammer community throughout January and February. And to give you a strong head start, we've corralled 3 in-house painters to impart their sage advice. If there's one thing Warhammer TV presenter Emma and Army painters Andy and James can agree on, it's that you've got to have a plan, even if it changes further down the line. Start by painting up a test model in a color scheme you want, Emma says. Or better yet, 2. You may find that the colors you like work on the armor or cloth of infantry, but not on tanks. So this is the best time to adapt to other colors that suit what you want in your army. I don't think this is necessarily bad advice. It's good to do some test models before you dive into painting an entire army project. But the truth is, if you use some basic stuff like color theory, I think that's going to help you out a lot more than just mashing some colors together on a model and just seeing how it looks. I think doing a little bit of work in preparation, then picking some colors, and then maybe doing a test model makes a lot more sense. And honestly, this statement from Emma doesn't really make any sense at all. So you're going to paint up a test model and you're going to find out that the colors you like work on the armor or cloth of infantry, but not on tanks. So now you're painting 2 test models and one is an infantryman and the other one's a tank. To discover this, it doesn't really make sense. So let's go ahead and scratch what Emma said here and just say the best thing to do is a little bit of preparation before you paint your army. If you're going to do a custom color scheme or something like that, do a little research, find out what colors work well together, check out color theory or a video on that, and then that's going to put you in a much better place. Now, it is important also to have an understanding of the products that you're using. So for instance, if you're using something heavily textured like a Death Guard Plague Marine, maybe something like a slap chop method is going to look nice. But if you're doing something like a tank or something like that, trying to use contrast paints on a large vehicle with flat surfaces, probably not going to work out that well. So you may want to seek some alternative method using a similar or the same color scheme. So I think this is best summed up by just saying, hey, before you jump in and start painting up all your models, go ahead and just do a little bit of homework. And that's going to put you in a much better place. And I think the number one thing that you're going to get out of doing a little homework is figuring out what is the primary color on all your models going to be and what is the most efficient way to apply that color. So for instance, in some cases, you may find that you want to slap chop everything, do a nice zenathal highlighting and then dry brush everything and then go back through with contrast paints. And that's going to be the best method for you. You may find in a different army that perhaps something like rattle canning or airbrushing, your Ultramarines army all blue right off the bat, may be a much better technique than individually painting the armor on every single model. So for me, if I'm trying to complete an army, the most important thing I'm trying to do is work on efficiency. So planning is going to make you much more efficient. So I think figuring that out is going to put you way ahead. So while I don't necessarily agree with exactly what Emma says here, but I think the overarching theme that Emma is trying to get at right here is essentially just do a little planning beforehand, and that's going to put you in a much better position to complete your army. Andy agrees. It doesn't have to be comprehensive, but before I start a new army, I want to have a rough idea of what it will include. Then I make a list of a few milestones I can aim for to keep me motivated, like a combat patrol or vanguard box. So again, I think this definitely goes to the planning. Ideally here, you're going to have a good idea as to what you're building towards. So if your goal is to build up a 2,000 point Warhammer 40K or a Sigmar army, you should have a couple milestones along the way. Maybe you want to slowly over time build up your army and have a functional play force in the meantime. So you're going to paint the first 500 points, then 1,000, then you're going to move up to 2,000. Or maybe you have a tournament coming up over the weekend and you just need to get literally everything ready to go and absolutely nothing is painted. As someone that's been involved in the hobby for over 30 years, I have to say there's 2 key scenarios that I have found play out in my life. When I was a competitive gamer, I would oftentimes be in a situation where very little or none of my army was painted, and I was days or weeks away from a tournament and needed to have the entire thing done. So quality was much less important than just getting everything done. And then there's the opposite situation where you might be building up to a 2,000 point army in some form of escalation league or just building a new army, starting with a couple of HQs and some troops, etc. In that case, I would definitely go the route that Andy suggested, where you have an idea as to like a 500,000 and then 2,000 point army, and you can work towards that goal. But as you're working towards it, you have a playable force that's functional as well. It's really good to have some milestones along the way. That way you can really enjoy the force, go out, play a combat patrol game, and then come back, work on your 1,000 points, meet back up with your friends a few weeks later, play some games at 1,000 points, and you feel the true reward of having a painted force on the table, and then that's going to motivate you further to paint the 2,000 point army. But I think overall, this is good advice. A particularly helpful habit is to have a neat and tidy hobby space, according to James. I completely agree with this. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people painting in a dingy corner, he says. They end up facing a wall in a terrible light with only a tiny bit of space on the edge of the desk to paint, and wondering why painting is no fun. It's always worth your time to tidy the paint area and do what you can to make it more enjoyable to spend time there. I completely agree with this. Having a clear and clean space is very important. Having all of your tools easily accessible within arm's reach is very, very important as well. And good lighting is honestly the most important thing. I think a lot of people underestimate how important light is. You think you have good lighting until you get another light. Once you install that light, you realize, oh wait, actually, I just couldn't see what I was doing this entire time. And it sounds funny and it sounds crazy, but honestly, it's true. I also make sure from time to time that I clean and reset my desk, adds Andy. It helps reboot my headspace, and when I change projects to reach a suitable goal in the army I'm working on, bright light, plenty of space, and a good bit of motivational Warhammer art are just as important as having the right brushes and paints on hand. So yeah, I have to agree. I think it's a great idea to tidy up your space on a regular basis. I think it's a great idea to get all of the tools, paints, whatever that you need all ready and prepared before you sit down. And then that way you have the least amount of disturbances. Because if you can sit at your desk for 2 hours and just paint the entire time, and you have something good on the TV in the background, and you have your good lighting and all your tools and your paints and everything ready to go, you're going to get a lot more done than if you have to periodically stop and go get things or adjust things or find something to watch on TV. Then next thing you know, your 2 hour period has gone by and you've achieved almost nothing. So I think this is excellent. Getting rid of other projects that you've already finished or that you're not working on, moving them somewhere different is definitely a good idea. On the practical side, Emma advises that you keep track of your sub-assemblies with small painted numbers, especially when building large numbers of arms separately from their bodies. Painting bodies separately from their arms can speed up the whole process massively, especially around the torso, but you'll need to make sure that Guardsman A doesn't get saddled with some mismatched arms for Guardsman B. So as someone that uses sub-assemblies, I think using sub-assemblies is important, but to tell you the truth, I think this is a terrible example by Emma. To tell you the truth, you shouldn't really be using sub-assemblies on rank and file guardsmen or something like that. If you have a character or key centerpiece or something super complicated like a large monster or something like that, by all means, use sub-assemblies, as it's going to allow you to reach areas that normally would be difficult. But if you're painting an army of guardsmen and you're going to have 50 or 100 or a couple hundred models, the last thing you want to be doing is sub-assemblies on individual guardsmen. The problem with using sub-assemblies on basic troopers is a lot of times it's unnecessary. One, nobody's going to pick up a random guardsman out of your 100 guardsmen and start looking at it and make sure that it's painted perfectly and that you got the backside of their gun or underneath their arms painted appropriately. You need to be focusing sub-assemblies and stuff like that on things like large monsters or characters. And the truth is, you should have absolutely no problem figuring out which arms go on your Space Marine captain and which ones go on your lieutenant. So yes, I do think it's important to use sub-assemblies, and it's important to keep track of them, of course. But the truth is, I think way too many people use sub-assemblies way too often when it's completely unnecessary. The one exception that I have found over time is, regardless of what army I'm painting, with almost no exception, I always paint the heads separately. So if you've been watching the channel for any amount of time, you've seen that I have the head racks, which are essentially just extra sprue that I have created into essentially like a little display rack that I can glue 10, 20, 30, or 40 heads onto. They're evenly spaced apart. They're all very easily accessible in a row, and I can essentially just go through and knock out a bunch of heads all at once. I don't have to go to each individual model and try to pick out all their details and worry about what parts of their shoulders are blocking what parts of their head, etc., etc. It also allows me to alternate things like skin colors and hair colors really, really easily and make sure that there's a rough amount of each so that there's a nice blend throughout an army. So for me, the most important thing when it comes to sub-assemblies is Only do them if you need to. Don't go overboard, because I've seen plenty of people that are painting up individual bits still on sprues, or taking off each of the arms and the head and the weapon and painting them all individually on just a regular guardsman and then putting them all together. And the truth is, you're never going to get 100 guardsmen done if you're painting each one of them in sub-assemblies. So make sure that you use the appropriate tools or techniques at your disposal, but do so in a way that is beneficial to the entire process, that is going to help you, not hinder you in your goal. And your goal is to just get a nicely painted army on the table. And now a quick message from this week's sponsor. This video is sponsored by cmogames.com, where you can get 15% off most Games Workshop pre-orders, and they go live right at midnight Saturday mornings. cmogames.com offers free shipping on orders over $25 in the US 48, and most orders ship within 24 hours. cmogames.com has been selling Games Workshop products online for more than 20 years, and customer service is their top priority. cmogames.com carries the full line of Games Workshop products, including 40K, Age of Sigmar, Kill Team, Warcry, paints, hobbies, and tools. Visit cmogames.com using the affiliate link in the description below so they know you heard about cmogames.com from Warhammer Man Studios. Now, back to the video. A trick James uses to keep motivation high is to base his miniatures early. Often, after only a few steps in the painting process, doing the bases after the base coat and contrast stages is a great way to trick your mind into thinking that you're almost finished. It's much easier to motivate yourself to sit down and do the shading and detail work when your miniatures already look complete. So I have to completely disagree on this one. I understand what James is getting at here, and it makes sense to kind of trick yourself into thinking, oh, I'm almost done so I can stay motivated. But the truth is, we talked about sub-assemblies earlier, and I mentioned specifically heads. And honestly, the other main thing that I always do in sub-assemblies is basing. It is much, much easier when you're doing 20 or 50 or 100 plus models to do all their bases together in what I refer to as an assembly line technique. So I will essentially figure out exactly how many bases I need, figure out the rough position placement for like the feet or points that attach to those bases, make sure to leave them clear, etc. And then I will go through and batch paint all of those bases. And then I will go through and do the rim of the bases as well. I'll complete the models, and then I will attach the models to the base. And then the final step is just to make sure that the model looks like it belongs on that base. So oftentimes I'll go around the feet with like a wash or a light dry brush or something like that to kind of blend them into their environment. This is much more functional. It saves tons and tons of time, the same type of thing as with the heads. And it keeps you from making unnecessary mistakes like too much wash dribbling down from your model onto the feet and creating pooling around the bases, or an inadvertent mistake from your paintbrush ruining a hard base that you worked on. So honestly, kind of throwing back to the sub-assemblies, I think the best thing to do is do your bases in sub-assemblies, and then you can just look at the base and then look at the guy, and then you can say, oh, look, I'm almost done. And it has the same effect as if the guy's actually already mounted to the appropriate base. Andy is also a big fan of basing his miniatures after the battle ready stage. He paints many of the armies featured on the Battle Report and the other TV shows, and his advice focuses largely around making effective use of your time. I completely agree with that. It's all about efficiency. Always stop and ask, could this be done with contrast, or could a dry brush achieve the same effects as a highlight? All of our tricks and techniques are perfect for personal hobbies as well. I work through all the same stages at a time, as it tricks you into seeing clear progress rather than reaching the end of a painting session and feeling no closer to completion. But of course, the most important thing at the end of the day is to have fun. So I do agree with this. It's important to have like regular goals along the way so that you can feel that moment of completion. Because honestly, when you complete a model or a project, it feels good and then it motivates you to continue on. Oftentimes the problem is people get overwhelmed because they're working on too many models or too many projects at once, and then they find it very, very difficult to actually ever complete one. The best feeling in the world for me is to complete a project. Whether it is for me personally or whether it's a commission, it always feels really good, and I get that sense of pride as I have finished something and now I get to move on to something else. And I do agree, in the end, the most important thing is to make sure that you're having fun. So maybe you don't get quite as many models painted if you have Lord of the Rings on in the background because you're focused on that during big fight scenes or something like that. But if you're enjoying yourself and you're able to paint much more often or get much more completed over the long run, even if you're less efficient at the time, I think that's perfectly acceptable. If you try to get rid of all the distractions and you shut off anything that might get in your way, you may find that you get bored easily. But if you have a nice podcast or movie or something like that on in the background, it can help your productivity and sustainability over time. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is not only being as productive as possible during your allotted time, but also being able to sustain the methods that you're using. Start small and build up is Emma's advice. Sometimes the biggest hurdle is keeping the painting speed going and enjoyment going. Taking a break by painting up single unique models in between bigger units keeps it fresh, but challenging. I totally agree here. I think oftentimes what I refer to it as is like the reward system. So if I'm starting off painting something like a combat patrol, starting army or something like that, I will paint the troops first. And then in between them, I'll focus on like a larger centerpiece, like a vehicle or a character. And it kind of gives me a break from a bunch of individual models and lets me focus on one much more important model. And it's also very important to realize, because we always talk about painting an army up to like a certain standard, as if every model in that army is painted to the same standard, but that's just not realistic at all. You should have your regular troops or less important models, the stuff that you have 10 or 20 or 50 of in your army, painted to just a basic standard, whatever the minimum is that you're going for. And then your characters and vehicles should always go above and beyond. And that honestly is going to make your entire army look like it's painted exponentially better. Because whenever somebody looks at your army, whether it's a picture or in person, whether they pick one of your models up or look at a distance, they're always going to focus in on those centerpiece models, which is oftentimes a character, a monster, a vehicle, something like that. So it makes a lot of sense to spend a little extra time on that centerpiece, and it's going to give your entire army an overall better look. And I think it's the same thing with basing as well. If you do a nice job on your bases or your faces, most people are going to notice the face, they're going to notice the base, and everything is going to look much, much better to them. They may spend a lot less time focusing on the actual paint jobs in between those two key points of attention. You will probably find very quickly that most people's eyes are drawn directly to the face of a model and then oftentimes to the overall basing of your army. And by having those two things in line and looking good, everything else is going to look even better. Enjoying painting will see you coming back day after day, week after week, offers James. If something isn't fun, changing it up and find a new way to paint that you enjoy. It's the fastest way to paint an amazing army. I completely agree. I think it's all about you enjoying the process. Everybody enjoys having a painted army or completing a project. That's a fact. But not everybody enjoys the process. And if you can figure out how to make your process more enjoyable or more comfortable, you're going to get a lot more done, and you're going to overall be much more productive and enjoy the hobby substantially more. I think overall this is a pretty good article. I don't agree with every exact tiny little point of the article, but the overall overarching theme is the most important. And honestly, I think the points of the article I agree with completely. So I think if I had to basically sum it up, I would say it's very important to start with a plan, work towards completion of that plan, do things efficiently and effectively, but make sure that you're enjoying yourself along the way. Use all of your tools and techniques at your disposal to make you the most effective and efficient painter possible, but make sure that you enjoy the process. So let me know what you think down below. Do you guys have any tips or anything like that? And if you are wondering, or you're new to the channel or something like that, just to let you know, the last 2 years in a row, I have painted over 600 models. I'm a commission-based painter, and I am on track to have the first 100 plus models of 2023 completed in the next week or so. So keep your eyes out for those. Special thanks to CMO Games for sponsoring this video. Check them out to save 15%. That's it for today. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and I'm out of here.